On a bright Saturday morning in the small town of Greenville, the sun was shining as Julia Thompson, the wife of retired veteran Captain David Thompson, stepped out of her home to do some grocery shopping. Julia was a calm, respectful woman known in the community for her kindness and active involvement in local activities. Her husband David, a man of honor, had served his country for over 25 years and was well respected. Together they lived a peaceful life after his retirement from the military. Julia cherished her routine. She would walk down to the local store, greet familiar faces along the way, and enjoy the fresh air. Today felt no different until she noticed a police car parked at the end of Maple Street as she rounded the corner. It didn't alarm her after all. Greenville was a safe town, and police officers were often seen patrolling to maintain that safety. However, as she approached the grocery store, she heard the police car engine start, and in an instant, it was right behind her. Confused, she glanced over her shoulder only to see a stern-faced officer stepping out of the car. He was a tall, broad man with a scowl that immediately made her uneasy. The name on his badge read Officer Parth. "Ma'am, I need you to stop right there," he barked, his voice cold and authoritative. Startled, Julia turned to face him, her bewilderment evident. "Excuse me?" she asked, trying to keep her tone respectful. "You match the description of a suspect involved in a robbery nearby," Officer Parth said, narrowing his eyes as he sized her up. Julia was taken aback. "I think there must be some mistake, officer. I'm just heading to the grocery store. I've lived here for years and have never been involved in anything like that." But the officer's face remained hard, unmoved by her explanation. "I'm going to need to see your identification," he demanded, his tone growing more aggressive. Shaken but trying to remain calm, Julia reached into her purse to retrieve her ID. "I have nothing to hide," she said, handing him her driver's license. Officer Parth glanced at it briefly before shoving it back at her. "This doesn't change anything. You're coming with me." "What? Why?" Julia asked, her voice trembling now. "I haven't done anything wrong." Without another word, Officer Parth roughly grabbed Julia by the arm, pulling her towards the police car. Shocked and terrified, Julia tried to resist. "Please let me go. I'm innocent. I'm just trying to do my shopping." But the officer wasn't listening. He slammed her against the hood of the car, twisting her arms behind her back as he slapped handcuffs on her wrists. "Stop resisting!" he yelled, though Julia wasn't resisting at all. Tears streamed down her face as she tried to comprehend what was happening. She was a law-abiding citizen, the wife of a man who had served this country with honor. How could this be happening to her? A few bystanders had gathered, watching the scene unfold. Some whispered to each other while others pulled out their phones to record, but no one intervened. The sight of a police officer manhandling a middle-aged woman like Julia was disturbing, yet fear kept people at bay. As Officer Parth shoved Julia into the back of the police car, her mind raced. She had heard stories about unjust treatment by the police, especially toward people who looked like her. But she never thought it would happen to her, especially not in Greenville. Officer Parth got into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut as he sped off toward the station. In the back seat, Julia sat trembling, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't understand what had just happened. All she had done was walk to the store like she had done so many times before, and now here she was, handcuffed in the back of a police car, accused of a crime she didn't commit. Her thoughts immediately turned to her husband, David. If there was anyone who could help her, it was him. David had faced countless challenges in his years of service, and he wasn't a man to back down when he knew something was wrong. He would know what to do, but how could she reach him? She didn't have her phone, and she had no idea what would happen once they reached the station. As they pulled up to the police station, Julia felt a surge of panic. What if they kept her here for hours? What if they didn't believe her? What if this was just the beginning of a nightmare that would ruin her life and reputation? Officer Parth yanked her out of the car, his grip still tight on her arm. "Let go!" he said gruffly, dragging her towards the station entrance. Julia stumbled along, her mind reeling. She had never felt so powerless, so violated. But deep down, she knew one thing for certain: her husband, Captain David Thompson, would not let this injustice stand. He was a man of action, a man of principle, and he loved her fiercely. Whatever happened next, she knew David would fight for her. As Officer Parth led her into the station, Julia felt a small glimmer of hope mixed with her overwhelming fear. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. She was led through the cold gray corridors of the police station, her heart still pounding in her chest. The harsh fluorescent lights above made the atmosphere feel even more intimidating. She couldn't believe that this was happening to her. Officer Parth's grip on her arm was tight, as if he expected her to bolt at any moment. But where could she run? She was innocent, yet the world around her seemed determined to treat her as though she had committed a terrible crime. The front desk officer barely looked up as Officer Parth shoved Julia toward a holding cell. She could feel the stares of other officers as she passed. Their gazes were cold and indifferent. No one bothered to ask what was going on or if she needed help. She was just another person to them, just another suspect in handcuffs. As they reached the cell, Officer Parth unlocked the door and pushed her inside. The sound of the metal bars clanging shut behind her made her stomach drop. It felt so final, so surreal. How could this be happening? "Stay here until we sort this out," Officer Parth said, his voice void of any empathy. "Sort what out?" Julia asked, her voice shaking. "I haven't done anything wrong." But the officer didn't respond. He turned on his heel and walked away, leaving her standing alone in the small, dimly lit cell. Julia's legs felt weak, and she slowly sat down on the hard bench in the corner. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but she fought to keep them back. She needed to stay strong. Somehow, she had to get through this. Her thoughts drifted back to David. He was probably at home, completely unaware of what was happening. David had always been her rock, her protector. Throughout his military career, he had faced dangers far greater than anything she could imagine. But now, she was the one in danger, and he wasn't there to help her. Julia wrapped her arms around herself, trying to find some comfort in the freezing room. She wondered how long it would be before someone realized the mistake that had been made. Surely they couldn't keep her here much longer. There had to be some kind of evidence that would clear her name. She had never been involved in anything criminal, let alone a robbery. Minutes turned into what felt like hours as she sat there, lost in her thoughts. She tried to replay the events in her mind, wondering how such an innocent trip to the grocery store had spiraled into this nightmare. Everything had been normal until it wasn't. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall, pulling Julia from her thoughts. She looked up, hoping it was someone coming to tell her they had realized the mistake. But it wasn't Officer Parth. He reappeared, this time with another officer, a younger man with a softer expression. He approached the cell, glancing at Julia with a look that seemed almost apologetic. "Officer Parth, can I have a word with you?" the younger officer said quietly. Parth grunted and nodded, stepping away from the cell. Julia couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched as the younger officer seemed to be questioning Parth. His face showed concern, while Parth's expression remained cold and indifferent. After a few moments, the two returned to the cell. "This is Officer Smith," Parth said with an air of impatience. "He is going to ask you a few questions." Julia nodded, feeling a small spark of hope. Maybe this officer would listen to her. Maybe he would see that she wasn't a criminal. "Ma'am, I'm sorry to have to ask you this, but can you tell me exactly where you were this morning before Officer Parth apprehended you?" Officer Smith inquired gently. "I was on my way to the grocery store," Julia replied, her voice steady despite her fear. "I left my house about 20 minutes before I ran into Officer Parth. I've lived in Greenville for years. Everyone in this town knows me. I would never be involved in something like a robbery." Smith nodded, jotting down notes on a small pad of paper. Do you have anyone who can verify where you were this morning? Yes, I was texting my husband before I left the house, Julia said. He can vouch for me. He is retired from the military, Captain David Thompson. He'll know this is all a misunderstanding. Officer Smith raised an eyebrow at the mention of her husband's name. It was clear that the name held some weight, even in this small town. He glanced over at Officer Parth, who shifted uncomfortably on his feet. All right, Smith said. I'll make a call to your husband and see if we can clear this up. As he stepped away, Julia felt a wave of relief wash over her. Finally, someone was willing to listen. Minutes later, Officer Smith returned. I spoke to your husband, Mrs. Thompson. He is on his way here now, he said. Julia felt a mix of relief and anxiety. She was glad David knew what was happening, but she was also worried about how he would react. David had always been a man of calm authority, but she knew that seeing her in this situation would ignite a fire in him. As the minutes ticked by, her anxiety grew. She knew David wouldn't let this go easily. He was a man who stood up for what was right, no matter the cost. When David finally arrived, she could hear his voice echoing through the station. He was demanding to speak to someone in charge, demanding answers about why his wife had been arrested. David stormed through the front doors of the police station, his presence commanding immediate attention. At over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a stern look that only years of military service could perfect, he was not a man who went unnoticed. I need to speak with whoever's in charge, David demanded, his voice steady but firm. My wife has been wrongfully arrested, and I'm not leaving until this is sorted out. The receptionist at the front desk looked up nervously as he approached, clearly taken aback by the intensity of his demeanor. I need to speak to someone now, David insisted. The receptionist stammered for a moment before picking up the phone and calling one of the senior officers. David stood there, fists clenched at his sides, his heart pounding with a mixture of anger and concern. He couldn't believe this was happening to Julia. The idea that she would be involved in anything criminal was not just absurd, it was impossible. As he waited, David caught sight of Officer Parth standing near the back of the station, arms crossed and an arrogant smirk on his face. Parth didn't look concerned in the slightest about the situation unfolding before him. If anything, he seemed amused by it. David's blood boiled. He could tell by looking at Parth that this man had something against Julia from the very start. David had seen men like Parth before, men who believed they had power simply because of the uniform they wore. Men who thought they could push others around without consequence. But David wasn't about to let that happen to his wife. Just then, a senior officer approached. His name badge read Lieutenant Harris, and he carried himself with the kind of respect and authority that David immediately recognized. Yes? David replied, his tone measured but filled with urgency. My wife was arrested for no reason. This entire thing is a mistake, and I want it fixed now. Lieutenant Harris nodded, motioning for David to follow him into a small office. I understand your concerns, Captain. Let us sit down and go over what happened. As they sat across from each other, Harris pulled out a file and began flipping through it. According to Officer Parth's report, Harris began, your wife was taken into custody on suspicion of being involved in a robbery that took place earlier this morning. She matched the description given by a witness at the scene. That's ridiculous, David said, his voice tight with frustration. Julia was at home with me this morning before she went to the store. She didn't rob anyone. Harris replied, she mentioned that she had been texting you before she left. I'd like to verify that information. David nodded, pulling out his phone and opening the conversation with Julia, showing Harris the timestamps of their texts from that morning. It was clear that Julia had been nowhere near the scene of the robbery at the time it occurred. Lieutenant Harris reviewed the messages, his expression serious. I believe you, Captain. But Officer Parth insists that your wife fits the description given by the witness. We'll need to conduct further investigation to clear this up. David could feel his patience wearing thin. With all due respect, Lieutenant, this isn't just a misunderstanding. This is a gross overreach by a racist officer who arrested my wife because of the color of her skin, not because of any real evidence. Harris looked up from the file, his eyes narrowing slightly. That's a very serious accusation, Captain. It's the truth, David replied without hesitation. I've served this country for over 20 years. I know what it means to protect and serve. But what Parth did, what he's doing, is nothing short of abuse of power, and I want to stand for it. Lieutenant Harris sighed, clearly troubled by the situation. I'll have to look into the details more closely, but in the meantime, your wife will remain in custody until we can fully investigate. David stood up abruptly, frustration boiling over. My wife doesn't belong in a jail cell, Lieutenant. She's innocent, and you know it. You have the evidence right in front of you. Release her. Harris hesitated for a moment, glancing back down at the file. I understand how difficult this is for you, Captain, but I can't make any decisions until I've spoken with all the parties involved. David gritted his teeth, barely containing his anger. He was used to dealing with bureaucracy. His time in the military had taught him that much. But this wasn't a battlefield where you had time to wait for orders. This was his wife's freedom they were talking about. Every minute she spent behind bars was a minute too long. Then I suggest you speak with whoever you need to speak with and do it fast, David said, his voice low and dangerous. Because if my wife isn't released soon, you're going to have a much bigger problem on your hands. With that, David turned and stormed out of the office, his heart pounding with adrenaline. He couldn't believe this was happening. The system he had spent years defending was now turning against his own family. As he walked back into the main lobby, he spotted Officer Smith standing by Julia's cell, speaking to her in hushed tones. Unlike Parth, Smith had treated Julia with some level of respect, and David was grateful for that. But it wasn't enough. Julia was still locked up, still being treated like a criminal. How is she? David asked Officer Smith, his expression hard. She's holding up, sir, but she's scared, Officer Smith replied. David clenched his fists, taking a deep breath. We're going to get her out of here, officer. I don't care what it takes. Officer Smith nodded, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. I'll do what I can to help, sir. David appreciated the sentiment, but words weren't going to fix this. He needed action and a way to expose the injustice that was unfolding right in front of him. As he stood there watching Julia through the bars, a plan began to form in his mind. It wasn't enough to just clear her name. He had to make sure that Officer Parth and anyone else involved faced consequences for their actions. This wasn't going to be swept under the rug. David left the police station with determination etched on his face. He walked briskly down the street, his thoughts racing. He knew that simply waiting for the investigation to be looked into wasn't going to cut it. The police weren't going to act fast enough, and the longer Julia stayed locked up, the more damage could be done to her emotionally and mentally. David wasn't just thinking about her wrongful arrest. He was thinking about the humiliation and fear she must be feeling in that cold, lonely cell. He stopped by his truck and took a deep breath, closing his eyes for a moment to remember all the battles he fought and all the times he stood firm in the face of adversity. This was no different. This was another battle, but this time the enemy wasn't on some foreign soil. The enemy was standing right here in his own country, hiding behind a badge. David climbed into his truck and started driving, his mind churning with ideas. His first stop was Henry Collins's house, another veteran who had served alongside him. Henry was a tough guy, someone David could count on no matter what. They had been through thick and thin together in the military, and David knew he could trust him now. Henry's house was only a short drive away, and within minutes, David pulled up in front of the modest home. He knocked on the door, feeling his nerves settle a little. When the door opened, surprise crossed Henry's face. David, everything all right? He asked, stepping aside to let him in. David shook his head, his jaw tight. No, everything's not all right. Julia's been arrested. Arrested? For what? Henry's eyes widened in shock. "They're accusing her of being involved in a robbery," David replied, the words sounding ridiculous as he said them. "It's all because of some racist cop who's out of control." Henry motioned for David to sit down. "Tell me everything." David sat, running a hand through his hair as he began explaining the situation: the arrest, Officer Parth's treatment of Julia, the flimsy evidence, and how the system was dragging its feet to clear things up. Henry listened carefully, his face growing more serious by the minute. "That's some heavy stuff," Henry said finally. "But it doesn't surprise me. I've heard about things like this happening way too often." "I'm not going to let it slide," David replied. "Julia's innocent, and I'm going to do whatever it takes to prove it." "Whatever it takes?" Henry raised an eyebrow. "Whatever it takes," David repeated firmly. "I want justice, and I want to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Parth isn't fit to wear that badge, and the department needs to be held accountable for allowing this kind of behavior." Henry sighed and crossed his arms. "You know what you're getting into, right? Taking on the police isn't easy, especially when they cover for each other." "I know," David replied, his voice steady. "But I've faced tougher odds before. I'm not afraid." Henry gave a slow nod, clearly impressed by David's resolve. "All right then, what's your plan?" "First, I'm going to gather every piece of evidence I can. I'm going to talk to witnesses, gather video footage, whatever it takes to prove Julia wasn't anywhere near that robbery. Then I'm going to make this as public as possible. I want the media involved. I want people to know what's going on." Henry frowned slightly. "The media? You sure that's a good idea?" "It's the only way to put pressure on the department," David explained. "If we make enough noise, they won't be able to ignore it. And if Parth thinks he can just get away with this because he's got a badge, he's in for a rude awakening." Henry sat back and nodded thoughtfully. "You've got a point. The more attention you bring to this, the harder it'll be for them to sweep it under the rug." David smiled grimly. "Exactly. I'm going to force their hand, and I'm going to make sure Julia walks out of that cell with her head held high." "Whatever you need, just say the word," Henry said, leaning forward. David felt a surge of relief at Henry's words. With Henry on his side, he felt like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. He stood up and shook his friend's hand firmly. "Thanks, Henry. I knew I could count on you." After leaving Henry's house, David's mind was clearer than before. He had a plan, and he had support. Now it was time to take the first step. His next destination was the local convenience store where the robbery had taken place. He pulled up to the parking lot, his eyes scanning the area. The place looked quiet now, but he knew it had been a different story earlier that morning when the robbery had allegedly occurred. David got out of the truck and walked into the store, the bell above the door jingling as he entered. A young clerk behind the counter looked up, offering a polite smile. David walked straight up to him, his military bearing impossible to miss. "Excuse me," David said. "I need to ask you about the robbery that happened here this morning." The clerk's smile faded slightly, replaced by a more cautious expression. Yeah, it was pretty crazy. The police were all over the place." "I'm here because my wife was wrongfully arrested for that robbery," David said, his tone calm but firm. "I need to know if you saw anything that can help prove her innocence." The clerk's eyes widened. "Your wife? Man, that's rough, but I don't know what I can tell you. I didn't see much. The cops said the suspect ran out of here pretty fast." "Did you see the suspect at all?" David asked, his voice calm but firm. The clerk hesitated. "I mean, I saw someone running out of the store, but it was all a blur, you know? The guy was wearing a hoodie, so I didn't get a good look at his face." David's heart sank a little, but he wasn't giving up. "Do you have security cameras? Anything that might have caught what happened?" The clerk nodded slowly. "Yeah, we've got cameras, but the cops already took the footage." David felt a surge of frustration but kept his tone even. "Did they take copies of the footage or just everything?" I'm pretty sure they made copies, the clerk replied. I can check with my manager if you want. David nodded. Please do. It's important. The clerk picked up the phone and dialed his manager, explaining the situation. After a brief conversation, he hung up and looked at David. The manager says you can take a look at the footage, but you'll have to come back tomorrow when he's here. Thank you. I'll be back tomorrow, David replied, feeling a small sense of progress. The next morning, David woke up early, determined to continue his mission to free Julia and bring justice to light. He had barely slept, his mind racing with thoughts of his wife and what she must be going through. Every time he closed his eyes, he pictured her sitting in that cold cell, confused, hurt, and scared. It was enough to fuel him with a burning desire to make things right. After a quick breakfast, he got into his truck and drove straight to the convenience store. He didn't waste any time. He knew that each moment Julia spent locked up was a moment too long. David had made a promise to himself, to her, and to Henry that he would leave no stone unturned. Today was going to be a crucial step in that process. When he arrived at the store, the parking lot was busier than it had been the day before, with people coming and going as they picked up their morning coffee and snacks. David didn't care about the crowd. His focus was laser sharp. He walked in, the bell ringing above the door just like before, and saw the same clerk behind the counter. This time, the manager, a middle-aged man with glasses and a serious expression, stood next to him. The manager approached David as soon as he saw him. You must be the man asking about the security footage, he said. David nodded. That's right. I need to see it. The manager gestured toward a door at the back of the store. Follow me, we have the footage stored in the office. David followed the man, his heart pounding in his chest. This footage could be a game changer. If there was anything at all, that proved Julia wasn't the one responsible, he was going to find it. The office was small and cramped, with a desk cluttered with paperwork and a few chairs scattered around. In the corner, a computer monitor displayed several different angles of the store. The manager sat down at the desk and started clicking through files, pulling up footage from the day of the robbery. There it is, the manager said as the screen showed the store just before the robbery took place. David leaned in closer, his eyes narrowing as he watched the footage intently. The camera captured the inside of the store, customers browsing, the clerk ringing up purchases. Everything seemed normal. But then, a figure entered the frame, a person in a dark hoodie with the hood pulled tight over their head. David felt his heart race. This was it. This was the moment that could clear Julia's name. The figure walked quickly through the store, moving toward the counter. Even from the camera's angle, it was hard to make out any distinct features. The hood obscured most of the face. But one thing was clear, this person was not Julia. They were taller, their build was different, and their movements were nothing like hers. David's heart soared with hope. This was proof. He could already see how this could work in Julia's favor. Can you zoom in on that? He asked, his voice tight with anticipation. The manager nodded and clicked a few buttons, zooming in on the figure as they approached the counter. As the camera focused, it became even more evident that the person was not Julia. David felt a rush of relief, but he knew this was just one piece of the puzzle. The footage continued to play, showing the person demanding money from the clerk, grabbing a handful of cash, and then sprinting out of the store. The whole thing lasted less than a minute, but it was enough to send Julia to jail based on the flimsy identification made by Officer Parth. David sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He had the proof he needed, but now he had to get it into the right hands. The police weren't going to just take his word for it, especially not Officer Parth. He needed someone who could help him fight this battle. Someone with legal expertise. Can I get a copy of this footage? David asked the manager. The manager hesitated for a moment, glancing at David with concern. I don't want to get involved in any legal trouble. You're not getting involved. This is about clearing my wife's name, David reassured him. The police already have their copy of the footage, but I need it to show they made a mistake. The manager sighed but eventually nodded. All right, I'll get you a copy. While the manager worked on making a copy of the footage, David sat back and thought about his next move. He needed a lawyer, someone who could present this evidence properly and challenge the police's actions. He didn't have a lawyer yet, but he knew who to call for advice: Samantha Lewis. She was a sharp attorney who had worked on veteran cases before and had a reputation for being tough, fair, and relentless in protecting her clients' rights. David had met her a few years ago at a veterans event and kept her contact information in case he ever needed legal help. He had a feeling that now was the time to use it. After getting the copy of the footage from the manager and thanking him for his help, David stepped outside the store and pulled out his phone. He scrolled through his contacts until he found Samantha's number and dialed. The phone rang twice before a professional-sounding voice answered. Samantha Lewis speaking. Samantha, it's David Thompson. We met a few years ago at the Veterans Fundraiser, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. I need your help. My wife's been wrongfully arrested, and I've got evidence that could prove her innocence. There was a brief pause on the other end before Samantha responded, her tone immediately shifting to one of concern. David, I remember you. What happened? David quickly explained the situation, laying out the details of Julia's arrest, Officer Parth's actions, and the security footage that showed a suspect who clearly wasn't his wife. This sounds like a serious miscarriage of justice, Samantha said after he finished. I'll take the case. We need to get that footage into the hands of the right people and push for Julia's release as soon as possible. David felt a wave of relief wash over him. Thank you, Samantha. I appreciate this more than I can say. Don't mention it, Samantha replied. I'll start working on this right away. Let us meet tomorrow morning, and we can go over everything in detail. I'll bring in an investigator to help us dig deeper into Officer Parth too. If he has got a history of misconduct, we're going to find it. David hung up the phone, feeling a renewed sense of hope. With Samantha on his side and the footage in hand, he finally felt like he had the tools to fight back. But he knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead. The next morning came quickly, and David felt a renewed sense of determination. He had spent the night preparing for his meeting with Samantha, going over the details of what had happened to Julia and gathering every piece of evidence he had. The security footage was safely in his possession, and he knew it was going to be key to turning this whole situation around. David arrived at Samantha's office downtown, a modest building that exuded professionalism and determination. The sign outside read Samantha Lewis, attorney at law, and David felt a glimmer of hope knowing that this was the woman who could help free his wife. He walked inside and was greeted by a friendly receptionist who led him to Samantha's office. She was already waiting for him, seated behind a large wooden desk, her glasses perched on the tip of her nose as she reviewed some documents. She looked up and smiled as David entered the room, motioning for him to take a seat across from her. David, good to see you, she greeted him warmly. I've already started looking into Officer Parth's record. It's interesting to say the least. David raised an eyebrow. Interesting how? Samantha pulled a file from her desk and slid it over to him. Parth has a history of complaints filed against him, several allegations of excessive force, racial profiling, and wrongful arrests. None of them have led to serious consequences, though. He seems to always manage to slip through the cracks. David felt his anger rising again. Of course. This is exactly the kind of cop who would target someone like Julia, he thought, knowing he had to act. Samantha nodded. It's likely, but with this security footage, we have a strong case to challenge him and clear Julia's name. We'll also need to keep digging into his past. If we can prove a pattern of misconduct, it'll strengthen our argument. David handed her the USB drive containing the store footage. Here's the footage. It shows the real suspect, and it's definitely not Julia. Samantha took the drive and inserted it into her laptop, watching the footage carefully. Nodding in agreement as David pointed out the details, she said, "This is exactly what we need. I'll file a motion to get Julia released on bail immediately, and then we'll start working on a full investigation into Parth. David felt a rush of relief at hearing those words. Thank you, Samantha. I just want her home. She shouldn't have to sit in that cell for something she didn't do. Samantha looked him in the eye, her expression serious. We're going to get her out, but I want to be clear, this won't be easy. Officer Parth has likely covered his tracks, and the department may be hesitant to admit any wrongdoing. But we have the evidence, and we're going to use it. David nodded, fully aware of the uphill battle they were facing. But with Samantha on his side, he felt more confident than ever. After their meeting, David left Samantha's office feeling anxious but hopeful. He knew things were moving in the right direction, but the fight was far from over. He couldn't stop thinking about Julia sitting in that cold jail cell, surrounded by strangers, wondering when she would be able to come home. Later that day, David returned home and sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had made a lot of calls in the past few days to family, friends, and even some of his old military buddies. But now there was one more call he had to make. It was to Captain Stevens, his former commanding officer. Stevens was a stern but fair man who had always respected David for his dedication and loyalty. After dialing the number, David waited as the phone rang. A familiar voice answered. Stevens speaking. Captain Stevens, it's David Thompson, David replied, relief washing over him. I need your help. My wife has been wrongfully arrested, and I'm dealing with a racist officer who is trying to bury the truth. Stevens' tone grew serious. Tell me everything. David explained the entire situation, from Officer Parth's arrest of Julia to the evidence he had gathered with Samantha's help. Stevens listened carefully, not interrupting as David poured out his frustration and anger. David, you know I've always had your back, Stevens said, his voice filled with resolve. This is unacceptable, and I want to stand for it. I have some friends in the police department, people who can help us apply pressure and make sure this case gets the attention it deserves. David felt a weight lift off his shoulders. Thank you, sir. I don't know what else to do. We're filing motions and gathering evidence, but it feels like it's taking forever. Don't worry, Stevens assured him. I'll make some calls, and we'll get this moving faster. In the meantime, keep working with your lawyer and make sure all your evidence is airtight. David thanked him again before hanging up. He felt a sense of relief, knowing that Stevens was on his side. Having someone with his connections and experience would be invaluable in this fight. The rest of the day passed slowly. David busied himself with small tasks around the house, anything to keep his mind from dwelling on the fact that Julia was still behind bars. He spoke with Samantha again in the evening, and she confirmed that the motion for bail had been filed. Now it was just a matter of waiting for the court's response. That night, as David lay in bed, he thought about everything that had happened. He had fought many battles in his life, both on the battlefield and off, but this one felt different. It was personal in a way he had never expected. The next morning, David woke up early, mind racing with thoughts of the upcoming hearing for Julia's bail. He couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that things could go wrong, but he pushed those thoughts aside. Today was about getting Julia home, and he couldn't afford to let doubt creep in. After a quick breakfast, he headed over to the courthouse, where the place was packed with people all waiting for their turn to see a judge. David scanned the room and spotted Samantha in the corner, flipping through a stack of papers. She looked up and waved him over. Morning, David, she said, her voice steady. We're up soon. I've got everything ready for the bail hearing. David nodded, trying to keep his nerves in check. He had been to court before, but never for something like this. The thought of Julia being treated like a criminal was still hard to wrap his head around. Minutes later, the bail hearing began. Julia was escorted into the courtroom, wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hands shackled in front of her. David felt a pang of sadness and anger at the sight of her like that. Julia had always been strong and independent, but today she looked defeated and tired from spending nights in jail. The judge, a stern-looking man with graying hair, reviewed the case file. Officer Parth stood off to the side, an air of arrogance surrounding him. Samantha stood up and began her argument, presenting the evidence they had gathered, including the security footage that clearly showed Julia was not the suspect. Your Honor, Samantha began confidently, we have clear evidence proving that my client, Julia Thompson, was wrongfully arrested. The security footage from the store shows a completely different individual committing the crime. It is clear that Officer Parth made a grave mistake in identifying my client. The judge raised an eyebrow, glancing over at the footage being played on a screen. The room was silent as the video ran, showing a tall figure who clearly did not resemble Julia in any way. David felt a flicker of hope as the judge leaned forward, watching closely. Officer Parth, however, remained unfazed. He didn't even look at the screen, as if he knew he could get away with it, as if nothing could touch him. That smug attitude was infuriating, and David had to force himself to remain calm. Samantha continued, given the overwhelming evidence of her innocence, I respectfully request that the court release Mrs. Thompson on bail while we continue to prepare for trial. The judge sat back in his chair, tapping a pen against his desk as he considered the request. For what felt like an eternity, the courtroom remained silent. David held his breath, praying that the judge would see reason and grant Julia's release. Finally, the judge spoke. I've reviewed the evidence presented, and it's clear that there are significant doubts about Mrs. Thompson's involvement in this crime. I'm granting bail at $10,000. David exhaled, relief flooding through him. Samantha gave him a small nod, indicating that they had done it. Julia was going to be released. The amount was high, but David was prepared for it. He would pay whatever it took to get his wife back home. As Julia was led away to be processed for release, David rushed outside to make arrangements for the bail payment. His old military connections came through once again. A few phone calls later, the money was wired to the court, and within hours, Julia was walking out of the jail, free at last. When she saw David waiting at the entrance, she ran into his arms. Tears welled up in both their eyes as they embraced, the weight of the last few days crashing down on them. I'm so sorry you had to go through this, David whispered, holding her tight. I just want to go home, Julia said, looking up at him with tired eyes. I've never been so scared in my life. I know, David said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her face. We'll get through this. We're going to fight this together. They headed home, the drive back filled with quiet conversation. Julia told him about her time in jail, the fear and confusion she felt being treated like a criminal. David listened, anger boiling beneath the surface. He had never felt so powerless in his life, but that was going to change. Once they arrived home, David made sure Julia was comfortable before heading to his office. He needed to continue the fight. Officer Parth's record of misconduct was about to become public, and David was determined to expose the officer for who he really was. David spent the next few days working closely with Samantha. They began to gather testimonies from people who had also been wrongfully targeted by Parth. One story after another painted a picture of a man who had been allowed to abuse his power without consequence. It was infuriating but also motivating. David felt a renewed sense of purpose knowing they were on the right path. During this time, the media began to take interest in Julia's case. Word had spread about the wrongful arrest, and journalists were eager to cover the story. Samantha warned David and Julia to be careful with the press, but they both knew that public attention could help apply pressure on the police department. One evening, a local news crew showed up at their door, requesting an interview. At first, Julia was hesitant. She didn't want her face plastered on TV as the victim of a wrongful arrest. But after some thought, she agreed. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about exposing the corruption within the police force. The interview aired that night, with Julia recounting her ordeal and the injustice she had faced. David sat next to her, his hand resting on hers as she spoke calmly and clearly despite the emotions simmering beneath the surface. The reaction was immediate. Viewers flooded the station with messages of support, and social media lit up with outrage over the situation. The pressure was building, but David knew this was only the beginning. There was still so much to uncover, and Officer Parth wasn't going to back down easily. As days passed, David kept working. He and Samantha filed an official complaint with the Internal Affairs Division of the Police Department, demanding an investigation into Parth's conduct. The wheels of justice were slow, but they were turning. Julia's wrongful arrest had stirred public opinion, and the media coverage only added to the mounting pressure on the police department. David and Samantha continued their relentless pursuit of justice, determined to hold Officer Parth accountable. Then, one chilly morning, Samantha called David with urgent news. "David, I've got something important. Internal Affairs is starting an official investigation into Officer Parth. This is our chance to push harder." They've asked for additional evidence and witness statements. David was relieved to hear that action was being taken, but he knew this was just the start. He had already collected several statements from people who had been mistreated by Parth in the past. Now he needed to ensure the investigation was thorough. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. David and Samantha worked tirelessly, going through records, interviewing witnesses, and preparing documents. They focused on building a solid case against Parth, determined to show that this wasn't just an isolated incident but part of a larger pattern of misconduct. Meanwhile, Julia was trying to adjust to life at home. The stress of the past few weeks had taken its toll. She spent her days resting, working on regaining her strength, and focusing on the positive. David made sure she had everything she needed, often staying up late to help with paperwork or research new leads. One evening, David received an unexpected visitor, Officer Brian Cole, a former colleague of Parth's, who had come forward with information about his behavior. Cole had retired from the force a few years earlier but had stayed in touch with some of his old contacts. He was troubled by the stories he had heard about Parth and wanted to help. "I've been following your case," Brian said, his voice serious. "I want you to know that Parth has a long history of abusive behavior. I saw it firsthand when we worked together. He was always quick to use excessive force and had a real chip on his shoulder." David listened intently. This was exactly the kind of testimony they needed to build a stronger case against Parth. "Why are you coming forward now?" David asked. "I retired because I couldn't stand working with him anymore," Brian said. "But seeing what he has done to your wife, it's just too much. I want to do whatever I can to help you." Brian agreed to give a formal statement to Internal Affairs, detailing his experiences with Parth. This was a crucial step, adding credibility to the claims of misconduct and illustrating a pattern of behavior. David and Samantha worked with Brian to ensure his testimony was as detailed and impactful as possible. While the investigation into Parth was underway, the media continued to cover the story extensively. Reports of Officer Parth's abusive behavior and the wrongful arrest of Julia were spreading far and wide. Public support for Julia was growing, and more people were speaking out against the police department's actions. David was busy handling interviews and speaking at community events, advocating for justice and transparency. Meanwhile, Julia was focusing on her recovery, spending time with friends and family, trying to stay positive despite the ongoing legal battle. One evening, as David was preparing dinner, he received another call from Samantha. "We've just received some new information," she said, her voice tense. "It looks like Parth might have been involved in other incidents that weren't reported. We need to verify this quickly." David's heart raced. If they could uncover more evidence of Parth's misconduct, it could make a huge difference in the case. He and Samantha immediately began working on tracking down the new leads and interviewing additional witnesses. The investigation was taking on a life of its own, with each new piece of evidence adding to the case against Parth. David felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. They were getting closer to exposing the truth, but there was still a lot of work to be done. As the days went by, the tension continued to build. The pressure on Officer Parth was immense, and David could sense that he was becoming more desperate. The next steps in the investigation would be crucial, and David was prepared to face whatever challenges came their way. As the investigation reached a critical point, David and Samantha awaited the findings with bated breath. They knew that the next steps could be pivotal in their quest for justice. The investigation into Officer Parth was making headlines. News outlets were closely following every development, and public interest in the case was at an all-time high. The pressure on the police department was mounting, and Parth was feeling the heat. He had hired a high-profile lawyer to defend him, but David was confident in their case. One crisp morning, Samantha called David with an update. "We have a crucial meeting with Internal Affairs today. They've asked to discuss the latest findings and the next steps. This could be a turning point." David felt a mix of anticipation and anxiety. The meeting with Internal Affairs was a significant opportunity to push their case forward. He spent the morning preparing, reviewing all the evidence they had gathered and organizing the witness statements. When the time came, David and Samantha arrived at the Internal Affairs office. The room was large and formal, with a long table in the center and several officers seated at one end. David took a deep breath and sat down, ready to present their case. The head of Internal Affairs, a stern woman named Officer Davis, welcomed them. "Thank you for coming. We've been reviewing the evidence and witness statements. We want to hear your perspective on the current situation and discuss the way forward." Samantha took the lead, presenting the evidence clearly and in detail. She highlighted the pattern of misconduct by Officer Parth and emphasized the importance of holding him accountable. David supported her with additional information and answered questions about the witnesses and their testimonies. Officer Davis listened carefully, her expression serious. "We appreciate the thoroughness of your investigation. This is a complex case, and we need to ensure that every detail is examined. We'll be conducting further interviews and reviewing all the evidence before making any decisions." David nodded, understanding the need for thoroughness. "We're committed to seeing this through. It's not just about Julia anymore, it's about making sure no one else has to go through what she did." As they left the meeting, David and Samantha felt a sense of cautious optimism. The investigation was progressing, and the Internal Affairs team seemed committed to getting to the bottom of the issue. But they knew that there were still challenges ahead. That afternoon, David received a call from one of the community activists. "David, we've got a lead on a new witness who might have crucial information about Parth's behavior. They're willing to come forward, but they're nervous about being involved." David arranged to meet with the new witness, a young man named Alex who had been a victim of Parth's aggressive tactics. Alex was hesitant but agreed to share his story. He recounted an incident where Parth had used excessive force during a routine traffic stop, leading to false charges being filed against him. Alex's testimony was powerful. It aligned with the other accounts of Parth's misconduct and added more weight to the case. David and Samantha worked with Alex to ensure his statement was detailed and accurate, knowing it could be a key piece of evidence. The media continued to cover the case extensively. Reports of Officer Parth's abusive behavior and Julia's wrongful arrest were spreading far and wide. Public support for Julia was growing, and more people were speaking out against the police department's actions. David was busy handling interviews and speaking at community events, advocating for justice and transparency. Meanwhile, Julia was trying to find some semblance of normalcy in her life. She spent time with friends and family, focusing on her recovery, and trying to stay positive despite the ongoing legal battle. One evening, as David was preparing dinner, he received another call from Samantha. "We've just received some new information," she said, her voice tense. "It looks like Parth might have been involved in other incidents that weren't reported. We need to verify this quickly." David's heart raced. If they could uncover more evidence of Parth's misconduct, it could make a huge difference in the case. He and Samantha immediately began working on tracking down the new leads and interviewing additional witnesses. The investigation was taking on a life of its own, with each new piece of evidence adding to the case against Parth. David felt a mix of exhaustion and determination. They were getting closer to exposing the truth, but there was still a lot of work to be done. As the days went by, the tension continued to build. The pressure on Officer Parth was immense, and David could sense that he was becoming more desperate. The next steps in the investigation would be crucial, and David was prepared to face whatever challenges came their way. The investigation reached a critical point. David and Samantha awaited the findings with bated breath, knowing that the next steps could be pivotal in their quest for justice. Julia's wrongful arrest had captured significant attention from the media and the public. With Officer Parth already suspended and facing charges, it was time to ensure real change was made. David and Samantha were ready for the big meeting with the police chief and the internal affairs team. They had worked hard to prepare, knowing this moment could determine the future of the case. As they entered the meeting room, filled with important figures, the atmosphere was tense. The police chief began, stating, "We are here to finalize the actions against Officer Parth and discuss the new measures to address the issues revealed by this case." David and Samantha presented their case, highlighting the evidence against Officer Parth and emphasizing the need for reform within the police department. As they spoke, it was clear that the officials were paying close attention. After they finished, Officer Davis addressed the room. "We agree that Officer Parth's actions were wrong. He is already suspended, and we are pressing charges, but we need to address the bigger issues too." The room remained silent as Officer Davis continued. "We will review our policies and training. New rules will be implemented to prevent racial bias and ensure all officers adhere to best practices." The announcement garnered mixed reactions, but David and Samantha exchanged hopeful glances. The promise of reform was encouraging, but they understood the importance of ensuring these promises translated into real actions. As the meeting concluded, David felt a blend of relief and determination. They had made significant progress, but the real challenge lay in ensuring the reforms were enacted and led to meaningful changes. In the weeks that followed, the police department began rolling out new training programs and policies to tackle racial bias. David and Samantha remained involved, ensuring the changes were happening as promised. Julia, still dealing with the emotional aftermath of her wrongful arrest, found comfort in the progress being made. The support from David, Samantha, and the community gave her hope. One day, David received a call from Officer Davis. "James, I wanted to update you. The new training programs are receiving positive feedback, and we're seeing early improvements. Thank you for your patience and ongoing support." David was encouraged by the news. Though there was still work to be done, the changes represented a step in the right direction. He remained committed to ensuring they led to real improvements. The case of Julia's wrongful arrest had become a turning point for the police department. It highlighted the need for change and demonstrated how persistence and advocacy could lead to meaningful reforms. As the case reached its conclusion, with changes underway, David and Julia looked forward with hope. The journey had been arduous, but it had sparked real change and established a new standard for addressing police misconduct. Though the fight for justice and reform continued, they were optimistic that the lessons learned would help create a fairer, more just system for everyone. With the case resolved and progress being made, David and Julia could finally begin to move forward. The experience had proven their strength and determination, and it showed how a committed individual, supported by their community, could effect real change in the face of injustice.